I'm Rebecca, 31, and when my toxic family took me to court demanding my dead grandmother's $2.3 million estate, they thought they had everything figured out. My stepmother Linda, my half-siblings, and even my own father were lined up against me, claiming I'd manipulated my dying grandmother into changing her will. But when I handed the judge a single piece of paper I'd been hiding for 6 months, everything exploded. Within minutes, police officers were storming into the courtroom to arrest half my family, and what they discovered about my grandmother's death would make your blood run cold. What do you think was on that piece of paper that changed everything? Share your wildest theories in the comments. If you love stories where the underdog delivers crushing justice to toxic families, smash that like button and subscribe because this courtroom revenge will leave you speechless. The way karma came for my family is absolutely perfect. My life became a nightmare when I was 12 and my father remarried Linda, a woman who came with 2 children of her own and an agenda that would take me years to fully understand. What started as a blended family quickly became a hierarchy where I was consistently at the bottom, treated like an unwelcome guest in my own home while Linda's children, Marcus and Sophia, were treated like royalty. The favoritism wasn't subtle. Linda would cook elaborate meals for Marcus and Sophia while leaving me a sandwich or telling me to make something for yourself. Family vacations became trips where I stayed with my grandmother while they traveled to Disney World, Europe, and other destinations that were apparently too expensive to include me in. Shopping trips excluded me because I was too picky or hard to shop for, while Marcus and Sophia came home with bags full of clothes and electronics. My father, David, had completely transformed from the loving single dad who'd raised me for 12 years into someone who seemed afraid to contradict his new wife. When I'd complain about the differential treatment, he'd make excuses about Linda still adjusting to having a stepdaughter, or remind me that I should be grateful for having a family at all since my mother had died when I was 5. The gaslighting was constant and sophisticated. Linda would do things like forget to include me in family photos, then act surprised when I noticed. She'd plan family activities during times when I had other commitments, then express disappointment that I wasn't participating in family life. She'd buy gifts for Marcus and Sophia's birthdays that were clearly more expensive than what I received, then act hurt if anyone pointed out the disparity. But the most damaging aspect of the dynamic was how it affected my relationship with my father. Linda had a talent for creating situations where defending me would require him to criticize her parenting or acknowledge that she was treating his daughter unfairly. Rather than deal with the conflict, he'd minimize my concerns and suggest I was being too sensitive or looking for problems that weren't there. School became my refuge, and I threw myself into academics and extracurricular activities that kept me away from home as much as possible. I maintained a 4.0 GPA, participated in debate team and student government, and worked part-time jobs from age 15 onward. My achievements were met with lukewarm congratulations from my father and complete indifference from Linda, while Marcus and Sophia's mediocre grades and minimal efforts were celebrated like major accomplishments. The one person who saw through the family dynamics and consistently supported me was my paternal grandmother, Eleanor. She'd been suspicious of Linda from the beginning and had watched the family transformation with growing concern and anger. Grandma Eleanor was sharp, wealthy, and completely unimpressed by Linda's manipulation tactics. "That woman is trying to erase you from your own family," Grandma Eleanor told me during one of our weekly dinners when I was 16. "But she's underestimating both of us if she thinks I'm going to let that happen." Grandma Eleanor became my sanctuary and my strongest advocate. She paid for my college tuition when Linda convinced my father that they couldn't afford to help with my education while simultaneously financing Marcus's expensive private school and Sophia's extensive art classes. She took me on the vacations I was excluded from, bought me the clothes and necessities my stepfamily deemed unnecessary expenses, and most importantly, she documented everything. My grandmother was a retired accountant who'd spent her career managing finances for wealthy families, and she had a meticulous approach to record-keeping that would prove crucial years later. She kept detailed notes about every instance of differential treatment, every conversation where Linda had badmouthed me, and every time my father had failed to defend his own daughter against his wife's psychological abuse. "Rebecca," she told me during my college graduation dinner, "I'm not going to live forever, and when I'm gone, I want to make sure you're protected from these people who've spent years trying to convince you that you don't matter." At the time, I thought she was just being dramatic. I had no idea that she was already planning the most elaborate revenge against my stepfamily that anyone could imagine, or that she was documenting evidence that would eventually send some of them to prison. What I also didn't know was that Linda had been scheming since the day she married my father to gain control of Grandma Eleanor's substantial estate, and that my grandmother was fully aware of these attempts and planning her own counterattack. The trouble started 3 years ago when Grandma Eleanor, then 84, began showing early signs of dementia. Nothing dramatic at first, occasional forgetfulness, some confusion about dates, the kind of cognitive changes that worried the family but didn't immediately impact her daily life. But Linda saw opportunity in my grandmother's vulnerability, and she moved fast to position herself as the primary caregiver and decision-maker. Linda convinced my father that Grandma Eleanor needed family support and shouldn't be living alone anymore. Within weeks, she'd moved my grandmother into the spare bedroom of their house, ostensibly to provide better care but actually to gain control over her daily life and isolate her from outside influences, particularly me. The transformation was immediate and devastating. Linda implemented visiting schedules that limited my time with Grandma Eleanor to brief, supervised visits. She hired caregivers who reported to her rather than to medical professionals, and she began making decisions about my grandmother's medical care, social activities, and financial management without consulting anyone else in the family. Linda says too many visitors confuse Grandma Eleanor, my father explained when I complained about the restricted access. We need to be mindful of what's best for her health. But during my limited visits, Grandma Eleanor seemed sharp and alert, especially when discussing Linda's increasing control over her life. "That woman is trying to isolate me," she whispered during one visit when Linda was out of the room. "She's been going through my personal papers and asking questions about my will and financial accounts." I started documenting these conversations, partly because I was worried about my grandmother's well-being and partly because her observations about Linda's behavior aligned with patterns I'd noticed over the years. Linda had always been interested in other people's money and possessions, often making comments about what she'd do if we had more resources or how unfair it was that some people had wealth they didn't deserve. The situation escalated dramatically when Linda convinced my father that Grandma Eleanor needed professional financial management due to her cognitive decline. They petitioned the court for conservatorship, with Linda as the proposed conservator, claiming that my grandmother was no longer capable of managing her $2.3 million estate independently. I hired a lawyer to contest the conservatorship, arguing that Grandma Eleanor was still mentally competent and that Linda had clear conflicts of interest as the proposed conservator. The legal battle revealed just how extensively Linda had been planning this takeover. She had medical records from doctors she'd chosen, testimony from caregivers she'd hired, and financial documentation that painted my grandmother as confused and vulnerable. But my grandmother surprised everyone, including me, by how clearly and competently she testified during the conservatorship hearing. She answered complex questions about her finances, demonstrated detailed knowledge of her assets and investments, and clearly articulated her concerns about Linda's motivations for seeking control over her estate. "I've been managing my own finances for 60 years, she told the judge with perfect clarity. "The only confusion I have is about why my son's wife thinks she's qualified to take over responsibilities I've handled successfully my entire adult life." The judge denied the conservatorship petition, ruling that while Grandma Eleanor might need some assistance with daily tasks, she remained mentally competent to make her own financial and medical decisions. Linda was furious, and the family dynamics became even more toxic as her plans for controlling the estate were publicly rejected. That's when Linda's approach shifted from legal manipulation to something much more sinister. If she couldn't gain control of Grandma Eleanor's assets through the courts, she'd find other ways to ensure those assets ended up in her family's hands. Over the following months, Linda ramped up her psychological pressure on my grandmother. She'd make comments about how expensive it was to provide care, how difficult it was to manage a household with an elderly person, and how much stress the situation was putting on the family. She'd suggest that Grandma Eleanor might be happier in a nursing home, then position herself as the generous daughter-in-law who was making sacrifices to keep the family together. Meanwhile, Linda began a campaign to turn Marcus and Sophia against me, telling them that I was selfish for challenging the conservatorship and that I was trying to steal their inheritance by maintaining a close relationship with Grandma Eleanor. She convinced them that my grandmother's estate should be split equally among all the grandchildren, ignoring the fact that they'd treated her with indifference for years while I'd been her primary emotional support. The most disturbing development was Linda's increasing interest in my grandmother's end-of-life planning. She'd bring up topics like funeral arrangements, burial preferences, and will updates during casual conversations, always framing these discussions as practical planning that needed to be addressed while Grandma Eleanor was still mentally clear. But my grandmother was documenting everything, and what she discovered about Linda's true intentions would eventually become the evidence that destroyed her completely. The last 6 months of Grandma Eleanor's life were marked by a dramatic decline that seemed to happen almost overnight. The woman who'd successfully defended herself in court against a conservatorship petition suddenly became frail, confused, and increasingly dependent on Linda's care. At the time, I attributed this decline to the natural progression of aging and stress from the family conflicts, but looking back, the speed and severity of the change should have raised red flags. Linda became even more controlling during this period, implementing strict medication schedules and dietary restrictions that she claimed were doctor-ordered but never seemed to have proper documentation. She hired a new caregiver, a woman named Janet who reported exclusively to Linda and seemed uncomfortable whenever I tried to discuss my grandmother's condition or care plan. "Your grandmother is very fragile right now," Linda would say whenever I questioned the restrictions or wanted to spend more time visiting. "The doctors say too much stimulation could be harmful for someone in her condition." But during the brief moments when I could speak with Grandma Eleanor alone, she'd often seem more alert and would make cryptic comments about not trusting the pills or pretending to be sicker than I am. I started to wonder if she was playing some kind of game with Linda, but I couldn't understand what the strategy might be. The most troubling incident occurred about 2 months before she died, when I arrived for a scheduled visit and found Grandma Eleanor unconscious on her bedroom floor. Linda called 911, and my grandmother was rushed to the hospital where doctors said she'd had a medication interaction that had caused her blood pressure to drop dangerously low. "It's so difficult managing all these prescriptions," Linda told the emergency room staff. "Eleanor gets confused about what she's taken and sometimes takes extra doses by mistake." But when I spoke with my grandmother after she'd recovered, she insisted she hadn't taken any extra medication and couldn't understand how the interaction had occurred. "I've been taking the same pills for years," she said. "I know exactly what I'm supposed to take and when." That's when I started keeping my own detailed records of my grandmother's condition, medication schedule, and the various incidents that seemed to occur whenever Linda was the primary caregiver. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. Grandma Eleanor's episodes always happened when Linda was alone with her, and they always seemed to involve medication-related complications. I tried discussing my concerns with my father, but he was completely under Linda's influence by this point. "Rebecca, you're being paranoid," he said when I suggested that something wasn't right about Grandma Eleanor's care. "Linda has been sacrificing everything to take care of your grandmother. The least you could do is be grateful instead of making accusations." The end came on a Tuesday morning in March. Linda called to say that Grandma Eleanor had passed away peacefully in her sleep, and that the family should gather to make funeral arrangements. I was devastated but not surprised. Her health had been declining rapidly, and at 87, death from natural causes seemed tragically inevitable. What I didn't expect was how quickly Linda moved to take control of the estate settlement. Within hours of my grandmother's death, she was talking about funeral expenses, probate procedures, and will readings. She seemed to know exactly what needed to be done and was already making appointments with lawyers and accountants. Eleanor left detailed instructions about how she wanted everything handled, Linda announced during our family meeting the day after the funeral. She was very specific about the distribution of her assets and the timeline for settling the estate. That's when Linda revealed what she claimed was my grandmother's final will, dated just 6 weeks before her death. According to this document, Grandma Eleanor had left her entire $2.3 million estate to be divided equally among David, Marcus, and Sophia, with a small $50,000 bequest to me in appreciation for her care and attention over the years. I was stunned. The will directly contradicted everything my grandmother had told me about her estate planning, and the language didn't sound like her at all. Grandma Eleanor had always been clear that she intended to leave the majority of her estate to me because I was the only family member who'd maintained a genuine relationship with her and hadn't treated her wealth as an eventual inheritance to be claimed. "This doesn't seem right," I said during the will reading. "Grandma Eleanor told me multiple times that she was leaving most of her estate to me. She was very clear about her intentions." Linda's response was swift and vicious. "Rebecca, your grandmother's mind was deteriorating rapidly toward the end. She was confused about many things, including her financial planning. This will was prepared by her lawyer while she was still mentally competent. But something about the timing and the specific language of the will felt wrong. My grandmother had been meticulous about her legal and financial documentation her entire life, and this will seemed hastily prepared and lacking the detailed provisions she typically included in important documents. That's when I made the decision that would ultimately expose the truth about my grandmother's death and Linda's role in it. I hired my own lawyer and contested the will, demanding a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding its creation and my grandmother's death. What we discovered during that investigation would lead to criminal charges, arrests, and justice for my grandmother that went far beyond anything I could have imagined. The moment I decided to contest the will, Linda's reaction told me everything I needed to know about the legitimacy of the document she'd produced. Instead of being understanding about my grief-driven concerns or offering to provide additional documentation to support the will's authenticity, she went into full attack mode, launching a campaign to discredit me and rush the probate process through court as quickly as possible. "Rebecca is just bitter because she realized she wasn't going to inherit everything," Linda told anyone who would listen. "She's been manipulating Eleanor for years, trying to turn her against the rest of the family so she could get more money." My half-siblings, Marcus and Sophia, who had barely spoken to Grandma Eleanor in the final years of her life, suddenly became passionate defenders of her final wishes. They hired expensive lawyers and began pressuring me to accept the will as written, claiming that fighting it was disrespectful to Eleanor's memory and tearing the family apart. But my lawyer, James Rodriguez, had extensive experience with estate fraud and elder abuse cases, and he immediately spotted red flags in the documentation Linda had provided. The will was notarized by someone who claimed to have witnessed my grandmother signing it, but there were no medical records documenting her mental capacity at the time of signing. The lawyer who'd allegedly prepared the document was someone my grandmother had never mentioned and who had no previous relationship with her legal affairs. "Rebecca," James told me during our second meeting, "I've seen a lot of suspicious wills over the years, and this one has all the hallmarks of a document that was either forged or signed under duress. We need to investigate not just the will itself, but the circumstances surrounding your grandmother's death." That's when we requested a full autopsy and toxicology report, despite the fact that my grandmother had already been buried. The legal process for exhuming a body is complex and expensive, but James was convinced that the medical evidence would support our suspicions about foul play. Linda fought the exhumation request aggressively, claiming it was barbaric and unnecessary to disturb my grandmother's remains. But her objections only strengthened our case that she had something to hide, and the court eventually approved our petition for a post-mortem examination. While we waited for the autopsy results, James and I began investigating the last months of my grandmother's life more systematically. We interviewed the hospital staff who'd treated her for the medication interaction incident, reviewed her medical records, and tracked down the various caregivers who'd been involved in her care. What we discovered was a pattern of suspicious incidents and documentation that painted a disturbing picture of systematic abuse and probable murder. Janet, the caregiver Linda had hired, admitted under oath that she'd been instructed to give my grandmother special medications that weren't prescribed by her regular doctors. She'd been told these were supplements to help with my grandmother's confusion, but she'd become uncomfortable when my grandmother started having adverse reactions. Mrs. Linda said Eleanor was being difficult about taking her regular medications, Janet testified during a deposition. She gave me these additional pills and told me to make sure Eleanor took them with her evening meal, but I noticed Eleanor always seemed more confused and weak the day after taking them. The hospital records from my grandmother's medication interaction incident revealed that she'd had dangerously high levels of sedatives in her blood, medications that weren't on her prescribed drug list and that could only have been administered by someone with access to her daily routine. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source, my grandmother herself. Hidden in her bedroom, James's investigators found a small digital recorder that my grandmother had been using to document her final months. The recordings were heartbreaking and infuriating, containing hours of my grandmother's observations about Linda's behavior and her growing suspicions about what was being done to her. "I'm not as confused as they think I am," my grandmother's voice said on one recording. "Linda has been giving me pills that aren't from my doctor, and I've been pretending to take them but hiding them instead. I think she's trying to make me sicker so she can control my money." Another recording, made just 2 weeks before her death, was even more explicit. "I'm scared Linda is going to kill me. She's been increasing the pills she gives me, and yesterday I almost passed out after taking them. I need to get this information to Rebecca before it's too late." The final recording was made the night before my grandmother died. "I think Linda knows I've been hiding the pills. She watched me take them tonight and made sure I swallowed them. If something happens to me, Rebecca needs to know that Linda has been poisoning me for months." When the autopsy results came back, they confirmed everything the recordings had suggested. My grandmother had died from acute poisoning caused by a combination of sedatives and blood pressure medications that had been administered in fatal doses. The toxicology report showed that she'd been systematically poisoned over a period of several months, with the final dose being lethal. Armed with this evidence, James immediately contacted the district attorney's office and filed criminal charges against Linda for first-degree murder. But we also had evidence that other family members had been complicit in the conspiracy to defraud my grandmother's estate, which meant the courtroom confrontation was going to be even more explosive than I'd anticipated. The stage was set for a trial that would expose the full extent of Linda's crimes and deliver justice that went far beyond anything I'd dreamed possible when I first decided to contest that suspicious will. The civil probate hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in September, 6 months after my grandmother's death and 3 weeks after Linda had been arrested for murder. Despite the criminal charges, the estate dispute had to proceed separately, which meant I'd be facing my entire family in court while Linda sat in jail awaiting trial for killing the woman who'd raised me. The family dynamics had become even more toxic since the criminal investigation began. My father, who was facing his own potential charges as an accessory after the fact, had completely cut off contact with me. Marcus and Sophia were furious that their anticipated inheritance had evaporated and were publicly blaming me for destroying the family with my false accusations against Linda. "You've turned our mother into a criminal with your lies," Sophia screamed at me outside the courthouse steps the day the murder charges were filed. "Everything was fine until you decided you deserved more money than the rest of us." The irony of her defending Linda as our mother was particularly nauseating, considering that Sophia had spent years complaining about Linda's controlling behavior and had only become supportive once Linda's crimes resulted in potential financial benefits for her. But what I discovered during the final weeks of trial preparation would make their hypocrisy even more outrageous. James had continued investigating the family's involvement in Linda's schemes, and what he found was evidence that Marcus and Sophia had been actively participating in the conspiracy to defraud my grandmother's estate long before her death. Bank records showed that both Marcus and Sophia had received large cash payments from Linda in the months leading up to my grandmother's death, payments that Linda had taken from my grandmother's accounts using power of attorney documents that had been obtained through forged signatures. They'd known exactly where the money was coming from and had willingly participated in stealing from an elderly woman who was being slowly poisoned. Even worse, text message records revealed that Marcus and Sophia had been aware of Linda's plan to eliminate my grandmother and had actively helped cover up evidence of the poisoning. Messages between Sophia and Linda included discussions about getting rid of the pills and making sure Rebecca doesn't find anything suspicious. Marcus had helped Linda dispose of the medication she'd been using to poison my grandmother, and he'd lied to investigators about his knowledge of her condition during the final months of her life. Both siblings had participated in creating false documentation about my grandmother's mental capacity and had provided false testimony to support the fraudulent will. The morning of the probate hearing, I arrived at the courthouse with James and a briefcase full of evidence that would destroy my family's claims to my grandmother's estate and result in additional criminal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. But I had no idea that James had prepared one final surprise that would make the confrontation even more dramatic. My father arrived with Marcus and Sophia, all of them accompanied by expensive lawyers who clearly believed they were going to walk away with millions of dollars. They'd spent weeks publicly positioning themselves as the real family who deserved my grandmother's estate, while painting me as a greedy outsider who was trying to steal money that rightfully belonged to Linda's children. Your Honor, Marcus's lawyer began during his opening statement, this case is about a family dispute that has been unnecessarily complicated by criminal allegations. My clients simply want to honor Eleanor Morrison's final wishes as expressed in her legitimate will. The audacity of calling the forged will legitimate while Linda sat in jail for murdering the woman who'd supposedly signed it was breathtaking. But I knew that by the end of the day, Marcus would be joining his stepmother in handcuffs. When it was our turn to present evidence, James began with the obvious fraud documentation, the forged signatures, the suspicious timing of the will, and the medical evidence proving my grandmother had been mentally competent when she'd allegedly changed her estate planning. But then he pulled out the piece of evidence that would change everything. Your Honor, James announced, I'd like to present evidence that not only proves the will is fraudulent, but also demonstrates that the defendants in this case were actively participating in a conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain. He handed the judge a single document that made everyone in the courtroom go silent. It was a detailed confession that Linda had written while in jail, desperate to negotiate a plea deal that would reduce her murder charges. In exchange for a lighter sentence, she provided a complete account of how Marcus and Sophia had helped her plan and execute the systematic poisoning of my grandmother. The confession revealed that the entire family had been planning my grandmother's murder for over a year, with Marcus providing the sedatives Linda had used for the poisoning and Sophia helping to create false medical documentation that would explain my grandmother's declining health. They'd all known exactly what they were doing, and they'd all stood to benefit financially from her death. As the judge read Linda's confession aloud, I watched my father's face turn white with horror and my half-siblings' lawyers frantically whisper about immediate plea negotiations. But it was too late for damage control. James had already coordinated with the district attorney's office to have arrest warrants prepared for Marcus and Sophia. The moment the judge finished reading the confession, police officers entered the courtroom and placed both of my half-siblings under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. The dramatic arrest, happening right in the middle of the probate hearing, was more satisfying than any revenge I could have planned myself. Justice wasn't just served, it was delivered with the kind of poetic irony that my grandmother would have appreciated. The chaos that erupted in the courtroom when police officers arrested Marcus and Sophia was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. One moment they were sitting smugly next to their lawyers, confident that they were about to inherit millions of dollars, and the next moment they were being read their rights and led away in handcuffs while news cameras captured every second of their humiliation. This is insane. Sophia screamed as the officers cuffed her. Rebecca set us up. She's been planning this from the beginning. Marcus tried to maintain some dignity, but his lawyer was frantically trying to negotiate with the prosecutors while his client was being arrested for murder conspiracy in open court. We need immediate plea discussions, he kept saying to anyone who would listen. My client was manipulated by his stepmother. The judge, who'd been presiding over what was supposed to be a routine estate dispute, looked stunned by the dramatic turn of events. This court will recess pending resolution of the criminal charges, he announced. Given the evidence presented today, the probate proceedings are suspended until all related criminal matters are concluded. My father, who hadn't been arrested but was clearly implicated in the conspiracy, sat in stunned silence as his wife was led away and his stepchildren were charged with murdering his own mother. The man who'd spent years choosing Linda over his own daughter was finally seeing the consequences of his willful blindness to her manipulative and criminal behavior. James pulled me aside as the courtroom cleared out. "Rebecca, I need you to understand what's going to happen next. This case is going to be national news. A family conspiracy to murder an elderly woman for her inheritance, with dramatic arrests during a court hearing. The media is going to be all over this story." He was right. Within hours, news vans were parked outside the courthouse and reporters were calling my phone asking for comments about the millionaire grandmother murder conspiracy. The story had everything the media loved: family betrayal, greed, murder, and dramatic courtroom justice. But the media attention, while overwhelming, also served an important purpose. It exposed Linda's crimes and my family's complicity to the entire community, ensuring that everyone who'd ever believed their lies about my greed and manipulation would now know the truth about who the real criminals were. The investigation that followed the arrests revealed the full scope of Linda's criminal enterprise and my family's participation in it. Phone records showed that Marcus and Sophia had been planning the inheritance theft for over 2 years, long before my grandmother started showing signs of cognitive decline. They'd researched methods for forging wills, looked into ways to accelerate an elderly person's natural death, and even discussed backup plans if their initial schemes failed. Most horrifying was the discovery that this hadn't been Linda's first attempt at elder abuse for financial gain. Investigators found evidence that she'd targeted my father specifically because of his mother's wealth, and that her entire relationship with him had been motivated by gaining access to the family assets. She'd researched our family's financial situation before they'd even met, and she'd planned the systematic elimination of my relationship with my grandmother from the very beginning. The financial fraud was even more extensive than we'd initially realized. Linda had been stealing from my grandmother's accounts for over 3 years, taking small amounts initially but escalating to larger thefts as my grandmother's health declined. Marcus and Sophia had been receiving regular payments from these stolen funds, essentially being paid to participate in the abuse and eventual murder of an elderly family member. Bank records showed that they'd stolen over $400,000 from my grandmother's accounts before finally deciding that outright murder would be more efficient than continued theft. They'd used the stolen money to fund expensive lifestyles while my grandmother was being systematically poisoned in the bedroom down the hall from where they were living. The psychological evaluation of Linda revealed a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic features, essentially confirming that she was a psychopath who felt no empathy for her victims and viewed other people purely as resources to be exploited. The report noted that she'd shown no remorse for my grandmother's murder and had only confessed in hopes of receiving a lighter sentence. Marcus and Sophia's psychological evaluations were equally disturbing. Both had developed criminal mindsets under Linda's influence, learning to view elder abuse and financial exploitation as acceptable methods for obtaining money they felt entitled to. They'd convinced themselves that my grandmother owed them an inheritance and that her resistance to their control justified increasingly extreme measures. My father, while not criminally charged, faced civil liability for his negligent supervision of my grandmother's care and his willful blindness to obvious signs of abuse. He lost his job when his employer learned about his connection to the murder case, and he faced social ostracism from everyone who'd known our family. The community response was swift and decisive. People who'd known my grandmother were horrified by the details of her murder and the family conspiracy that had enabled it. The church where she'd been a long-time member held a memorial service that focused on her life and achievements rather than the circumstances of her death, and several community organizations established scholarships in her memory. But the most satisfying aspect of the entire situation was watching the complete destruction of Linda's carefully constructed family hierarchy. The woman who'd spent years positioning herself as the moral center of our family, who'd convinced everyone that I was the problematic outsider, was now facing life in prison for murdering an innocent elderly woman for money. The step-siblings who'd treated me like an unwelcome burden while claiming superior moral standing were now facing decades in prison for participating in a murder conspiracy. And my father, who'd chosen his wife over his daughter for nearly 20 years, was facing the rest of his life knowing that his choices had enabled the murder of his own mother. Justice had been served in the most complete and satisfying way possible. 1 year after that explosive courtroom scene, I'm sitting in my grandmother's house, now my house, writing this story and reflecting on how completely my life has transformed. The legal proceedings are finally over, the criminals are behind bars, and I've inherited not just my grandmother's estate, but also the satisfaction of knowing that justice was served in the most dramatic way possible. Linda was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted that the systematic poisoning of an elderly family member represented one of the most callous and premeditated crimes he'd encountered in 30 years on the bench. Linda showed no emotion during sentencing, confirming the psychological evaluation that had diagnosed her as a remorseless psychopath. Marcus received 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. His defense attorney tried to argue that he'd been manipulated by Linda, but the evidence of his active participation in planning my grandmother's death made that claim impossible to sustain. He's currently serving his sentence in a maximum security prison and will be eligible for parole when he's 47 years old. Sophia was sentenced to 20 years for her role in the conspiracy. She maintained her innocence throughout the trial, claiming she'd been protecting the family and had no idea Linda was actually poisoning my grandmother. But the text messages between her and Linda discussing getting rid of evidence and making sure Rebecca doesn't find anything proved she'd been fully aware of what was happening. My father avoided criminal charges but faced devastating civil consequences. He lost his home when he couldn't afford the legal fees for defending against wrongful death lawsuits, lost his job when his employer learned about his connection to the case, and faced complete social ostracism from everyone who'd known our family. He's currently living in a small apartment and working part-time jobs while trying to rebuild some semblance of a life. The most satisfying moment of the entire ordeal came during Sophia's sentencing hearing, when she tried to give a statement claiming that I'd destroyed the family with my false accusations. The judge interrupted her to point out that she'd participated in murdering an elderly woman for money and that I'd simply sought justice for a victim who couldn't defend herself. "Ms. Morrison," the judge told her, "your victim's granddaughter didn't destroy this family. Your crimes destroyed this family. Your greed destroyed this family. Your willingness to participate in murder for financial gain destroyed this family." Rebecca Morrison saved the only thing worth saving, the truth about what happened to Eleanor Morrison. The estate settlement was straightforward once the criminal convictions were finalized. I inherited my grandmother's entire $2.3 million estate plus additional damages from the civil suits against Linda's family. The house where I'd spent so many happy hours with my grandmother became my permanent residence, and I've turned her home office into a memorial space filled with photos and mementos from her extraordinary life. But the money, while life-changing, isn't the most important thing I gained from this experience. The most valuable inheritance was the validation that my instincts about my family had been correct all along, and the knowledge that standing up for what's right sometimes requires courage that you don't know you have until you need it. I've used part of my inheritance to establish the Eleanor Morrison Foundation, which provides legal assistance to elderly people who suspect they're being financially exploited by family members. Too many seniors face abuse from people they trust, and too few have advocates willing to challenge family members who view elder abuse as an acceptable way to access inheritance money early. The foundation has already helped dozens of elderly people expose financial abuse and protect their assets from predatory family members. We work with lawyers, social workers, and law enforcement to investigate suspicious changes in wills, unexplained medical incidents, and patterns of isolation that often precede elder abuse. My personal life has also transformed in ways I never expected. The trauma of discovering my family's crimes was devastating, but it also freed me from decades of gaslighting and manipulation that had made me doubt my own perceptions and worth. For the first time in my adult life, I'm not trying to earn love from people who view me as competition for resources or obstacles to their financial goals. I'm currently dating a wonderful man I met through victim advocacy work, someone who understands trauma recovery and appreciates my commitment to justice rather than seeing my inheritance as an opportunity for himself. The contrast with my family's approach to relationships couldn't be more stark. The media attention from the case eventually died down, but the story became a cautionary tale about family greed and the importance of protecting vulnerable elderly people from abuse. Several documentaries have been made about the case, and I've spoken at conferences about recognizing signs of elder abuse and the legal steps families can take to protect senior members. The most unexpected development has been reconnecting with extended family members who'd been pushed away by Linda's manipulation over the years. My grandmother's sister, who I hadn't seen in a decade, reached out after learning about the case and shared stories about her own concerns about Linda's treatment of my grandmother. Several cousins have apologized for believing Linda's lies about my character and expressed regret for not maintaining relationships with me during the difficult years. "We all knew something was wrong with how your stepmother treated you," my great-aunt told me during our reunion dinner. "But nobody wanted to get involved in family drama, and Linda was very convincing when she portrayed you as the problem. We should have trusted our instincts and supported you." The validation from family members who'd witnessed the dysfunction but remained silent was both healing and frustrating. It confirmed that the abuse I'd experienced was obvious to outside observers, but it also highlighted how easily people can be manipulated into enabling harmful behavior when challenging it seems uncomfortable or complicated. The house where I now live has been completely renovated to remove any traces of the trauma that occurred here. I've turned Linda's former bedroom into a library, and I've created a garden memorial for my grandmother in the backyard where she used to grow her prize-winning roses. The space feels peaceful now, filled with positive memories rather than the horror of those final months. I still think about my grandmother every day, not just because of the inheritance she left me, but because of the example she set in standing up to people who tried to diminish her. Even while being slowly poisoned, she was documenting evidence and planning for justice. Her courage in her final months inspired my own determination to see the case through to conviction, no matter how much pressure I faced to let sleeping dogs lie. The most important lesson from this experience is that trusting your instincts about toxic family members isn't being dramatic or oversensitive. It's often being realistic about people who view your well-being as less important than their own financial interests. My grandmother's recordings revealed that she'd been aware of Linda's true nature from the very beginning, but she'd hoped that love and patience might eventually change her. What she learned, and what I learned, is that some people are simply incapable of genuine love or empathy, and they view other people's kindness as weakness to be exploited rather than gifts to be treasured. So here's my question for all of you watching: have you ever had family members who seemed more interested in your money or possessions than your well-being? How did you handle discovering that people you trusted were planning to exploit or harm you? Do you think the sentences my family received were appropriate for their crimes, or should they have been even harsher? I love hearing from other people who faced toxic family situations and found the courage to seek justice despite the social pressure to keep family problems private. Drop your stories in the comments below, whether it's about elder abuse, inheritance theft, or family members who revealed their true nature when money was involved. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about standing up to toxic families and fighting for justice even when it means going against everyone you're supposed to love. Share this video with anyone who's ever felt like the difficult family member for refusing to enable harmful behavior. Thank you for watching my grandmother's story and mine. Remember, you don't owe loyalty to people who would harm you for money, regardless of their relationship to you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is ensure that criminals face consequences for their actions, even when those criminals happen to be family. Here's to Eleanor Morrison, who taught me that standing up for what's right is more important than keeping peace with people who don't deserve it. Here's to justice served with perfect timing and dramatic flair. And here's to the courage to trust your instincts even when everyone else tells you you're wrong. Until next time, keep fighting for the truth and never let anyone convince you that family loyalty means tolerating criminal behavior. The best revenge really is living well, but sometimes it's also making sure murderers go to prison where they belong.